back to the live exchange. I am Dr. Pamela, and today we are talking about mass incarceration, police brutality, and really the pivot and the revolution, I will dare I say, the modern day revolution that we're seeing to address these issues. And it'll be really interesting with a new president in office who has previously been really dragged for some of the ways that he voted, for, the crime bill in previous years, but is now committed to addressing these issues nowadays. And so I'm very excited to just wait and see what happens, and to allow this thing to unfold, because I'm pretty confident that he is going to pull through and get some things going. But let me introduce my guest, because I'm sure he has a perspective on this as well. So Richard B. Pierre is an award-winning writer, director, and producer known for tackling a range of genres and subject matters. Pierre, a mixed-race Black filmmaker, has been placing his focus on race-based projects, such as Uninvited Guest. And this project comes on the heels of the successful documentary, What Are You? By the serious filmmaker. The idea for an uninvited guest came to the talented director after watching the 6 o'clock news report on the murder of a Black man by police. Unfortunately, not an uncommon headline. The video repeated several times on a seemingly endless loop, and Pierre realized that he could easily become numb to the horror, and yet each time it played, it was as fresh and as real as if it had just happened right in front of him. In that moment, he realized he had to do something other than just get angry. Thus, an uninvited guest was born. Welcome, Richard Pierre of Afroflix Films.
Thank you for having me on the show.
No problem. I'm excited to have you on the show. I'm curious to know, can you recall which of the many police shootings you saw that said, that at the 6 o'clock news that you said, I've got to do something about this?
So I'm going to dodge that question, and I'll give you a reason why. A few months ago, I read this wonderful little article written by one of the family members of one of the numerous victims of police brutality in America. And it was all about how she felt that when artists used their loved one's name as like this sort of jumping off point into their art, that it was almost like a re-traumatization, because she would have to see this name yet again.
Yes.
And I guess it's one of the many downsides of your loved one becoming a hashtag. So when I first came out with the film, I was more than happy to talk about it, but now I've tried to sort of stay away from that, so as to, I guess, respect the families and recognize that, my art shouldn't have the effect of re-traumatizing a family who's already suffered so much.
Wow. I absolutely appreciate that perspective. It really actually is a very different approach than the say their name movement. And so I'm curious to know what your thoughts are about that movement, with regards to, saying their name, putting their names out there, not forgetting, because you make a valid point that has to be incredibly traumatizing for the family.
Yeah, I don't think there's an easy yes or no answer to that, like what makes the most sense. Certainly every single time I see a video, the hashtag is going to be there of whomever name there might be for that video.
Right.
But certainly that article made me think more, at least as a creative person, how I'm addressing it when I'm talking about my film, and not trying to, I don't want to shy away from the fact that these stories are inspired by real life, but I don't want to in any way, make someone feel even more awful than they probably already do.
Right.
But yeah, I think, when these videos come out, I don't know that we have any way around using those hashtags, because those names are going to be in print. They're going to be everywhere for X number of months. Yeah. After that process is ended and I'm making a movie that's maybe, a direct response to that, I don't necessarily need to bring up that name again for people to understand what I'm talking about. So for artists, I think it's easy for me to say, this is inspired by one of those incidents.
Yes, that's and you know, I completely respect that. I think that's you know, a noble way to honor the families, because they are the ones who, you know, were most directly impacted by this. So I appreciate that. Are you in touch with any of the families? I know you mentioned one. Was that a part of your collaborative work?
No, I haven't been in touch with any of the families of any of the incidents. You know, I've certainly thought about it on occasion, and I think if I was making like a documentary that was like, you know, directly related to, I would definitely reach out. But
Yeah.
I'm imagining a lot of these folks have had far too much interest in their lives and would probably
Yes.
rather not talk about it. I'm sure there's some that are more than willing to, but I think for the vast majority, it's probably been, you know, sensory overload, because even as like I think us as a general audience, it's the volume of material out there that seems to just be endless is just too much for us. So as someone who's
Right.
directly experienced it, I wouldn't want to be in their shoes.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's I really appreciate that. Um, so I want to start with this first one. You know, what are you? So tell us about that. I have an idea, but but I would love for you to just expand on what the purpose of that film was and what you wanted it to do.
Yeah, I mean, What Are You is a short documentary about mixed race identity. I'm a mixed race person, so I figured I've always wanted to do a documentary, and I figured this would be a fairly simple topic because I'm already born an expert, as it were. But there was still a lot of research for me to do. And basically, what I did was I collected stories from 11 different Canadians about their experiences being mixed race, mostly in Canada, although a couple of us are actually Americans. So I'm an American. I was born in Oakland,
Okay.
raised in San Diego until I was about 8 or 9. Then we came up to lovely Toronto, Canada, and that's pretty much where I've been ever since.
Hmm.
But yeah, so some of the other participants are actually have similar stories where they were raised partly in the States, born in the States. So yeah, that was that film.
Okay, very interesting. I definitely want to delve into some of that. We're going to go to a break, and so on the other side of that, I definitely want to hear some of your perspective on some, you know, all these things that are happening, and then what your identity means in all of this. Because I can't imagine. I have, you know, heard plenty of perspectives, but I would love to hear yours. So when we come back, we are going to get into trending topics, and then we're going to continue this conversation. So stay with us on the live exchange. I'm Dr. Pamela, and I'm guessing we're saving trending topics for a little later, but I am joined by our guest, Richard B. Pierre, and he's a filmmaker, and he has really done some films to address some issues as it pertains to identity, as it pertains to police brutality. And so, Richard, as you know, in terms of the work that you've done with your films, particularly Uninvited Guest, it, you know, focuses on the idea of mixed race identity. How does mixed race identity impact your perception of what's happening with police brutality? Because, you know, we've obviously got very differing points of views that are sometimes very racially charged.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good and complicated question. I think I'd like to think as a mixed race person, I have an interesting perspective on the world. I think a lot of the time, mixed race people tend to be a little bit more, I want to say, racially hyper aware. So
Yeah.
partly because, like, even in my own family, I could potentially see racism from one side and then understanding of what's going on in the universe on the other.
Right.
So yeah, for me personally, boy, I mean, obviously what's going on has been frustrating and traumatizing at times. And it's weird that we've lived in this world for as long as we have. Like, in some ways, you don't feel like history has moved forward all that much. I mean, we're going into Black History Month, and it's just like, how different is today from 50 years ago? How different is it from 70 years ago? How different is it from 200 years ago? And obviously, you know, I'm being a little facetious, but there is a lot of things that are the same. Like, we're still here. I thought, you know, civil rights happened and the world was a happy place. So why are we still here?
It's interesting because I think in every lifetime we expect to see dramatic changes in the way that, you know, race and racism plays out in this country. So, you know, with the Renaissance era, which you know, early 1920s, and Black people are rocking, and they're doing all these amazing things. They're getting educated, they're creating in the arts. They're, you know, we've got Harlem is buzzing, and you would think at that time only place we can go is up. There's, you know, we're done with all of that. You know, Jim Crow was still happening, but we weren't slaves anymore, and we were able to get education and pursue careers. So we're just gonna, you know, keep pushing. And while Jim Crow got dismantled, while civil rights movement happened, while we started having Black studies programs at colleges and universities, the underpinnings never really went away. We still have the foundation. And I think that speaks to what you're saying about, well, we thought this stuff would be over by now, but it hasn't been dismantled.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's the frustrating point. You know, you think, you know, oh, we've had the Black president, so, you know.
That was supposed to do it too, right?
I remember that. I forget what is the saying that they had after that? We're post-racial, and I was just like,
oh gosh.
The minute that came out, I was just like, you guys are ridiculous. Yeah. Who says this? Who thinks this?
It was like we instantly knew, okay, we're still where we were. Just, yeah, that term was very indicative of the blindness and the lack of willingness to address it.
Yeah, and then Trump comes into power, and you're like, wow, we are regressing at a rapid rate.
Yeah.
I'd like to mention I am an American, and I still vote in the elections. So.
Thank you.
Yes.
We needed it.
Yes.
We needed it. And that's another key thing, is these votes were so critical, and we got to see just how important those votes were. I have to say, I live in Georgia, and I take it very personal when I see and one of my guests checked me on this. They were like, you don't need to carry all that. But I was taking it very personal when the insurrection happened, and there's all this push and all this movement to really just invalidate the Georgia vote, because I was like, I'm one of those people who cast that vote, and you are directly trying to disenfranchise my voting right and my voice. So this stuff is still happening.
Yeah, it's unbelievable and not shocking all at once.
Right.
I think that's the conundrum.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think in many ways we should be more shocked, but it's a slow change.
When you in your description here, as for the second film, Uninvited Guest, one of the things that's mentioned here is that, you know, and I'm speaking to the piece about you saying we should, you know, probably be more surprised. We have, you know, these images that just keep going through. We see them all the time. We become numb to them. But at the same time, as it says here, it still kind of makes the whole thing fresh and reminds us this is still happening. How do you, and I'm asking you this on a personal level, how do you manage your sanity and your peace of mind and all of that when these things continue to play out?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I probably need a therapist.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, for me, as I'll say first, as a human being, it's been like 2020 was difficult to say the least. I mean, it just felt like after George Floyd, there was just so many other videos, and you're just like, come on, like this has to end at some point. We can't just be stuck here forever.
Right.
But yeah, personally, I don't always manage it well. but I do try to remind myself that I should.
But you know what? And that speaks to the idea that this is a very real thing that we are battling. It's not just about what we see on TV. It's not just about the larger social movement. It is also about us being able to manage our everyday lives and go to work and still function and do what we have to do with this weight that still exists on our shoulders. But we're going to go, and when we come back, we're going to talk about that. We're going to look at actually a trending topic. It's kind of a paralleling issue, not directly the same, but I would love to get your take on that. So everybody stay with us, and we'll be right back on the live exchange.
Primary election, diversity aspirations. Trending topics.
Okay, so trending last week, we saw and I think actually this happened on the evening of January 28th, and in a Brooklyn wine store incident is, the thing that's been buzzing. So a 31-year-old woman was reportedly attacked on the evening of January 18th by 3 men after she had just patronized a liquor store in the Harlem neighborhood of New York City. And from what the woman said of the attack, she described one of the 3 men as being a quote unquote animal due to him allegedly trying to bite her eye out. And she basically had to get stitches. It was an attack after one of the men offered to buy her a bottle of wine, and she politely declined, and they did not take that well. And it just turned into this horrible attack, and they took her phone, and she is completely obviously traumatized as a result of this incident. What I definitely want to point out, though, is that as a result of this incident, a large crowd came to the liquor store in support of her. And particularly Black men have been speaking out that we can't do this to our women. We have to protect our women. And there's been this whole conversation between Black men and Black women about whether or not Black men are protecting Black women. And so on one hand, you've got this dichotomy where these Black men attack this woman, but on the other hand, you've got this movement of Black men who are saying, no, that is not us. That's not what we tolerate. We're going to stand for her. Did you hear about this case, Richard?
I actually missed this. So this is actually news to me.
Yeah. I think there's an interesting relationship between Black men and Black women that I think has been largely impacted by incarceration. If we've seen, why can't I think of it right now? The movie based in New York.
When They See Us?
Are you
thinking of When They See Us?
No, it was oh my gosh, it was all about him being possibly incarcerated, or him being accused of a rape. It's some street. I cannot believe I can't think of it. It was a phenomenal movie. But it really shows how when a Black man, he was accused of a crime that he did not commit, he is focused on his family and building a family and having this, stability and getting a house and the foundation. He gets accused of this crime. He goes through trial. He's found guilty. He's doing this time because there really was no good evidence. And it just really rocked the foundation of that family. And so I say this to say, I point this out, Beale Street Blues, Beale Street something. It's coming. Somebody's listening, like screaming the name, and but it's just, there has been a profound impact on the dynamic between Black men and Black women because of the incarceration and police brutality and what that does to the foundation of the family. And I'm just curious to know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, mass incarceration is, a terrible thing, and like the rates at which obviously Black people in the U.S. in particular are incarcerated is alarming, and the sentences are always, extreme or seemingly extreme. So yeah, that's going to obviously disrupt family units and cause strife in communities, and therefore plunge people into more poverty, trauma,
Right.
all sorts of things. So I mean, it has like a ripple effect for sure.
Yeah. Yes, it does. And it's also a cyclical effect because you see this, just kind of continuing on. And it's so easy to just point to the outer view of it and say, well, look what they're doing. Well, there's such a deeply rooted foundation to, what's happening. Now tell us about the, uninvited guest, and I guess the biggest thing that you wanted us to get out of it.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a fairly short film, but I mean, really, the film is, I like to describe it as dinner in the Twilight Zone by way of racial profiling and police brutality. And ultimately, what it's, I guess, trying to show, or at least communicate to people, is that we all play a role in this cycle.
Yeah.
And to hopefully just spark a conversation about how to change that.
Yeah. And have those conversations been happening? Are you hearing anything that's encouraging?
Yeah, I mean, I think the conversations are happening. I've gotten a fair bit of like press reviews and a fair number of film festival screenings that I've gotten some good feedback from. So I think it is sparking the conversation. I'm also very fortunate that the film got released in 2020, where we were,
Yes.
I think collectively the world was finally waking up to something Black people have been aware of since time immemorial.
Yeah. Right.
So yeah, I mean, 2020 was a great year in a sense to have that conversation and have it become a larger one. And hopefully it continues to go on. But I'm cynical.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if we're going to get out of the loop or stay in the loop.
And it's interesting because I feel like this is that pivotal moment where we make that decision, where we decide, are we going to get out of this loop, or are we going to, just kind of get comfortable and rest on our loins and let things just kind of go back to the way they were? Now, I have said many times throughout 2020, particularly after we started seeing the protests after George Floyd, I've dared to say that we are in the middle of a revolution. Would you agree, or do you think that's a bit extreme? Is it too soon to say that? Do you think that we're in the middle of a revolution as it pertains to institutional racism here?
It certainly, you want to say yes. You want to feel like that is the case, because it does seem like it. There's been a lot of little changes. I'm not going to call them big changes, but a lot of little changes have been happening, and it will be interesting to see if the majority can keep the momentum going, because we can't be the ones pushing. We shouldn't be the ones pushing, period, but we can't be the principal people pushing this forward, because there's, as strong as we are, we just can't move the mountain. Everyone has to help move the mountain.
Yeah. And the way that I think humanity works, or if you just look at the history, the timeline, if the powers that be don't get on board with the people that are being oppressed, there indeed is a revolution, and it's not usually very peaceful, and it's not usually very sweet. There's bloodshed. There's a lot of things that happen. And so I think this is this is not a threat. I'm just following history here. I think that this is a time where really important decisions need to be made. Are we going to be on board? Those who are privileged white males who have positions of power, companies and organizations that have power, are they going to jump on board with this and continue the momentum, like you said? Or is it going to have to be a bloodbath? I know that sounds real dramatic, but that is really the only way things have shifted, when the resistance continues, until the powers that be decide to jump on board. I don't know how, and maybe we've evolved as a society where we don't have to go there.
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting time for sure. And I do think that like companies are getting on board, which is great.
Yeah.
Like when you see, I mean, right after George Floyd, like a lot of corporations were seeming to get on the bandwagon, but even if it was performative,
Yeah.
I mean, that was revolutionary in and of itself. Like it was a big step to have big companies say, you know what, this actually matters, and we're going to take a risk and actually stand up for something.
Yeah.
So if we see more of that, if that
Right.
continues, you know, I think the world can be at least a marginally better place. But when it comes to like
Yeah.
police brutality specifically, I mean, I think we have to have radical change there, and not just in the US. I mean, this happens in Canada as well. I mean, people think Canada is like this, you know, utopia sometimes, but we have the same problems because we've been infected by the same virus.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that is that virus of hate and discrimination and racism. What you used a word just now that ironically I wrote it down maybe 3 minutes before you said it. I heard it first by Bakari Sellers on an interview probably in the spring, and he had used the term performative justice, and that idea that, you know, it's great, it's well and good, it looks wonderful for people to, you know, give lip service and say they're going to do this or make a statement. A lot of people, you know, there was imagery during the protest of police officers kneeling with the protesters, and there were questions: was that performative justice, or are they really on board? What are your thoughts about that idea of performative justice? Is it helpful? And how do you know when it's the real deal or if it's just, you know, for face?
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem, right? I mean, we don't know.
Yeah.
And, you know, when a corporation like Nike, for example, you know, takes action, that's great. I think they actually do have a bit of a track record of trying to be involved. You know, when the sheriff decides that he's going to take a knee, you know, that certainly looks good. And it, even as a symbolic gesture, I think it is a good step forward. But if it isn't backed up by actual change within that organization, then what does it really matter? Like it helps in the moment for sure. It helps inspire people, and maybe it opens people's eyes who wouldn't even think, like they're like, oh, if the sheriff actually takes this issue seriously, maybe I should too. So there is an impact there. But if the organization doesn't change, if Nike still has poor corporate policies, if the sheriff's office still hires bad deputies, then what has changed?
Exactly. And I appreciate the kind of the double point of view that you have here, because on one hand, perhaps by seeing the sheriff kneel, take a knee, and seeing these actions, it certainly did inspire people. It, you know, it became a ripple effect. At the same time, it doesn't stop there. And it might have felt really good to do that in the moment, but now it's time for the hard work of, like you said, hiring and firing as necessary. We're gonna take another break. So stay with us and we'll be right back. All right, welcome back to the live exchange. I'm Dr. Pamela, and I am joined by Richard B. Pierre, and we are talking about police brutality, mass incarceration, and really this potential revolution that we might be in the middle of as a result of the different work that we've done, the different pushing, the different movements that I guess have happened over 2020. And so I just want to share a little bit of research, just kind of looking at a little bit more deeply at this issue. In the last few decades, the institutional contours of American social inequality have been transformed by the rapid growth in the prison and jail population. America's prisons and jails have produced a new social group, a group of social outcasts who are joined by the shared experience of incarceration, crime, poverty, and racial minority and low education. As an outcast group, the men and women in our penal system institutions have little access to the social mobility available to the mainstream. Social and economic disadvantage, crystallizing in penal confinement, is sustained over the life course and transmitted from one generation to the next. This is a profound institutionalized inequality that has renewed race and class disadvantage. This is by Bruce Western and Becky Pettit, talking about incarceration and social inequality. This is a huge concern because, you know, a lot of the I guess less thoughtful statements about incarceration is like you do the crime, you do the time, but that's not really what happens. You do the time, and sometimes it's not even because you did the crime, but you do the time and you come out and you no longer have access to the things that tend to lead to, you know, livelihood and life and prosperity that other people have. Would love to hear your perspective on how, you know, how you've seen this impact, you know, these long-term impact of people as a result of being incarcerated, and how this, you know, are we going to a break? It looks like we're going to a break. So we're going to a break. I want to hear your perspective on that, Richard, when we come back from that.
Sure.
So stay with us on the live exchange. All right. Well, welcome back. Welcome back to the live exchange. You know, just the whole imagery, the feel of it. I love it. I love it. So that was a little bit from Uninvited Guest. Right. What do you plan on doing with this next? I know that you've showcased it in different film festivals and so forth. What's next for Uninvited Guest?
So yeah, I mean, we're still going to be playing some film festivals, so hopefully people in your audience can check it out. Who knows? Maybe one day it'll make it down to Atlanta.
Yes.
But yeah, definitely it'll be some online film festival streaming options. Eventually it'll land on YouTube, but we actually won an award at Holly Shorts, which is an Oscar caliber film festival, and we got Best Thriller. And as a result of that, a production company reached out and they were like, hey, are you going to make this into a feature film? So that is something that I'm working on the script for. So we'll see what happens there. And who knows, maybe there's a longer version of my short in the near future.
I love it. I love it. Well, you know, I definitely got that whole Twilight Zone feel, modern day. So I can appreciate films like that. There seems to be a trend right now with films that are addressing race and kind of bringing in a little bit of that horror to it, because that's really what it is. You know, it's really kind of the ultimate horror film because it's so real. Right before the break, I was asking about you know, incarceration and when somebody gets out and the kind of life they have to navigate after that, because the stamp is on them when they apply for jobs, you know, when they talk about their history, where they've been for the last 5 years, and they're behind. You know, do you have any thoughts or perspectives on it, you know, what can we do, if anything, to kind of even the playing field? Is it possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly a huge conversation in and of itself. I've done a little research. I've always wanted to really take a deeper dive into that particular topic. But yeah, just from my limited knowledge, I think the problem there is, you know, if people go to jail and they're punished for their crime and they've done their time, why are we penalizing them again when they get out? That doesn't make sense to me. Like, as a society, that's not the goal. I remember, I think it was maybe a year or two ago, I read an interesting article in the New York Times, and it was all about Texas. And Texas it still is obviously a very Republican type of state. But what they realized was that by, you know, educating and, you know, making opportunities for prisoners, they had a lower recidivism rate. So people weren't just getting out of jail and going back to jail, because why waste money on housing people in the prison system if you don't have to? Why not make productive members of society? Isn't that the whole point? Wouldn't you rather have someone who has a new skill and can contribute to the economy as opposed to someone who has no skills and guess what, has to steal again?
Right.
I mean, that it's a logical thought process. You want these people to be reformed. You don't want them to be criminals.
I guess that depends on who you're talking to. You know,
yes,
do you want them to be reformed or do you not want them to be reformed? What is the purpose of the system? And here's the cynical conspiracy theory me coming out.
Oh, I already know what you're saying, and I agree.
Yeah, it's that is not the intent of the systems, and it should be. And this is why conversations like this are so important, because we cannot let up on really dismantling the system as it is and rebuilding it and recreating it, because it is not rehabilitative unless we have a group of activists or passionate people who decide, you know what, I'm going to go into the prisons and do this work, or somebody who happens to work within the system that says, I see what the inmates are going through and when they come out, what happens. So I'm going to reform that. But the creation of this system, really, it was never about reform. And there's a lot of resistance for that to even, become the case. So I agree with what you're saying. And I guess it just depends on who we're asking. When we ask the question, what do we want? Do we want people to come out reformed or not? And the sad truth is that there are people who, if they were really being honest, would say, no, we want them to stay in that cycle.
Well, especially I think in the US, so in the States, it's, I'll say, a lot more profit driven. So you have, commercial prisons basically that, they make money off of inmates. So why would you want to do anything to stop making money? It's
Can you imagine?
If it's for profit, then you want to make profit. You want those people to stay in jail as long as possible, and you want more of them for longer. So I mean, America has a uniquely, frustratingly designed system of, this perpetual prison industrial complex.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite ingenious, and I don't say this in a good way, to witness how we gradually moved from a system of slavery right into a system of incarceration. It was just kind of this seamless process. When slavery was, made illegal, a Black man can get arrested on a street if he was not employed. That was a felony. So let's make things felonies that are going to be more likely to impact this population of people so that they can stay incarcerated and enslaved.
And I mean, that's the legacy we're dealing with, right? I mean, that's also why police can justify and say, oh, Black people commit more crimes because they're always in prison. But the reason they're always in prison is because we designed a system whereby they would be the majority of the prison population, and that cycle just keeps on going.
And not that I want to really highlight one of the senators, they showed up a whole bunch of videos of her now, stating that the problem with Blacks and Latinos is that they is gangs. That's the problem. That's why they're being held back. I should say, that's why we are being held back, because of these gangs. And if we can let go of the gangs, and it's not the white people, these are her words, it's not white people holding us back, it's the gangs holding us back. And when you live in 2021 and you hear lucid people making statements like that, it reminds us that, first of all, your films are needed, and second of all, deep, serious change needs to happen. Hirings, firings, who are we putting in office? And I appreciate that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, President Biden and Vice President Harris, are intentional about bringing people of color into these positions, bringing young people into these positions, bringing just a variety of people with varying levels of ability, various religions, because what they're doing is creating an infrastructure that is radically different from anything we've ever seen. And I think that alone, no matter how we feel about what Joe Biden has done in the past, that alone is going to change the trajectory of the future, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely want fresh voices and you want diverse voices, because those white voices haven't been working, period.
No, not when that's the only voice out there, and particularly when that voice is a voice that wants to protect the security that they've experienced since the beginning of this country starting. Largely problematic. So yeah, of course, people are going to push and revolt and be mad because they are afraid of that level of security now being threatened. So I tell you, cynical me is coming out, but there's so much. So I know we only have about 4 minutes before we for you here. So I would love to hear how people can follow what you're doing, how they can stay in touch with you, how they can reach out if they are interested in your work.
Definitely. I mean, you can just go to my website. That's the easiest one. If you go to richardbpierre.com, or there it is down there, afroflix.ca. I'm sure you can drop me an email or follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and drop me a DM, and I will respond, because I got lots of time on my hands. It's a pandemic, so
it is a pandemic. Thank you so much. And do you have any? I kind of would love for you to just take a moment and I guess express any thoughts about solutions or what we can do moving forward. I know it's a huge undertaking, this whole racism thing. But is there anything that you suggest that we can do as individuals to move the agenda forward?
I think as individuals, I think, the more outspoken everyone is, I think that's a huge thing. Like in 2020, when people were actually, being vocal on Instagram and Twitter, I think that did have a collective impact.
Yeah.
I think those small gestures are good. I think, donating money is even better if you can afford to, BLM or, any sort of criminal justice organization that helps free innocent people, or even, that helps people who maybe did commit the crime and are guilty, helps them, better themselves and, have a more opportunity once they're released from prison. Yeah. Those are huge. I think writing into your politicians and voting. I don't know that voting sometimes has the impact we want it to, but not voting certainly isn't a very good solution either. So
it's not. And it has an impact this time. I'll tell you that much.
Yeah, run for office. I mean, yes. I would never consider that. Well, at least at this point, I would not consider that myself. But other people who might be able to do that should.
And everything is not for everybody. So I am all for supporting those who do run for office and who have an agenda that I can believe in. I'm going to support you 100%. And so all of those things that are vitally important: give money, vote, vocal, social media, all of those things. So I encourage, yes, do all of those things. They do make a difference. There are people doing the grunt work out there, and they need the support. So, thank you once again, Richard, for joining us today. I really appreciate you and your insight. I'm going to be looking for your films. Your films are the exact, at least from what I saw with Uninvited Guests, the exact genre that I am deeply into, because they're compelling. They get deep into the core, and I appreciate the work that you're doing.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Yes, absolutely. Anytime. All right, everybody, we are going to continue this conversation. So stay with us, get involved, and we'll see you in a second. Good afternoon, and welcome to the second half of the live exchange, where today we are talking humanity, intellect, and change, as we do every week. But today in particular, we are looking at police brutality and mass incarceration, and primarily because As I call it, in 2020, I think we were experiencing the beginning of a revolution. We have seen a number of different changes that have happened, particularly after the the murder of George Floyd, and so much has happened since then. And even leading up to that, it was just kind of a breaking point that really ironically led us to a place where we've got to do something. So that is what we're talking about today. And on this hour, I'm going to be joined by Robert Jenkins. He's an attorney, and we'll further discuss possible solutions that we can begin to implement today and in the future. So I am ready for this conversation. I hope that you are too. So stay with us. We'll be right back on the live exchange. See, bringing me in with this song makes me just want to sit and just listen. And this is my jam right here. But welcome back to the live exchange. I'm Dr. Pamela, and today we are talking about mass incarceration brutality, which essentially means we're talking about institutional racism. I want to introduce my guest for this hour. Robert L. Jenkins Jr. is a native of Charleston, South Carolina. He's a graduate of historic Howard University, located in Washington, D.C. At Howard University, Mr. Jenkins obtained a Bachelor's of Science degree in history. He received his Juris Doctorate from the National Law Center at the George Washington University. Mr. Jenkins actively handles a variety of criminal defense matters, representing juvenile and adult clients. He has spent his entire career as an attorney, principally defending citizens charged with offenses in federal and state courts. He has successfully defended individuals accused of drug-related offenses, sexual assaults, tax violations, as well as capital murder. In 1998, Mr. Jenkins' professionalism and accomplishments as a trial advocate were recognized with his election to the George Mason American Inns of Court as a barrister. Since 2017, he has been listed among the top criminal defense attorneys in the Washington, D.C. area by the Washingtonian magazine. Welcome, 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 Robert Jenkins. Hello.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'm so glad that you were able to join us today. I have so many questions. But I want to start first in terms of what brought you to this career. There's a lot of, you could be a defense lawyer, you could be a prosecuting lawyer, and the perception is prosecuting lawyers, they want to put the bad guys in jail. Defense lawyers want to make sure that whoever is being accused is getting a fair trial. And so I'm just curious to know your perspective and how you came to this career.
Well, I think you touched on it. For me, growing up where I did in the environment I did back in Charleston, South Carolina, I grew up most of my life in public housing, in poverty. I saw a lot of interactions with members of our community with law enforcement, and oftentimes felt like, they weren't being treated fairly. And I've been blessed with certain talents and opportunities, and I wanted to apply them toward helping those individuals who were less fortunate, didn't maybe have the same resources to be able to defend themselves against, law enforcement overstepping their bounds. And so that's what really motivated me to be a defense attorney.
I love it. I love it. And I'm curious to know, I'm going to ask you the big question, and then we can pare down into some of the more intricate details. But in general, the system of mass incarceration, what is your take on that in terms of what it does to young Black men, Black women, to people who are caught up in that system? Is there a way out? What is your overall view of the system of incarceration?
Well, certainly what we've experienced in this country, locking people up and throwing away the key simply has not solved the problem. Whether it is poverty, whether it is violent crimes, whether it's drug abuse, we know one thing for certain, even if we don't know what the true solution is. We know that simply locking people up and throwing away the key has not solved those problems. Ever since we started on this trend of mass incarceration, whether it be, contributed to or attributed to the drug epidemic in this country. We still have drug abusers. We still have the associated violent crimes and things that go along with it. So it doesn't work. To me, we have way more than enough historical, empirical data to convince us that mass incarceration simply does not work as a policy. So we need to really explore other alternatives.
Yeah, and so I'm going to bring out a little bit of the conspiracy theory me out for this question.
Okay.
Because you said, this is not, locking him up, throwing away the key is not the solution. But then my question is, but is it? Is it the solution? Because what is the problem that we're trying to solve? Are we all on the same page about what the problem is? The way that this system was created, I think it is exactly the solution for what the creators of the system wanted. That was the solution. Get rid of them, put them over there. So what solution are we talking about, and who are the people behind that solution?
Well, in my opinion, the driving force behind most crime in this country, as well as all other societies, really is poverty. Mm-hmm. When people lack adequate resources to meet their needs, then they're going to go to whatever extent they need to in order to survive. We're sort of wired that way in our DNA to survive, to perpetuate our own gene pool. And when people don't have adequate resources, then things that have been criminalized start to become an option. So in my opinion, what we really need to focus our attention on is how do we solve the poverty issue in this country? If people had adequate resources, they'd be less likely to steal. If they had adequate resources, they would be less likely to turn to criminal behavior in order to support themselves. So that's where the real focus and attention needs to be.
Yeah, well, and I think I'm on the same page with you on that. And, I will say, I believe, and, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that there are competing agendas that are happening here. So on one hand, we have the people like you and I who says, let's tackle the poverty issue. And then we have the systems that are financially benefiting from incarceration continuing on exactly as it is. So when you have let's heal the people versus let's keep making money, there seems to be a clash in values and a clash in agendas there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that certainly is true. And while I'm a part of the system, part of the industry, some would say, those of us who are primarily responsible for administering our system of justice aren't eager to put ourselves out of business, if you know what I mean. So, some could even fairly label some of that criticism toward us also. But there are a lot of competing interests. And in a capitalist society, some would argue that there's always going to be a bottom class. That's just the nature of a capitalist system. And for those who are on the top of the system or are doing very well, the system is serving them, then they don't have the same motivation or interest to solving the poverty issue. Why? They're comfortable, their needs are being met, their resources are being satisfied, and their children are thriving in the current system. So it's all a part of a vicious cycle where you have to question whether or not there truly is a motive and interest in this country to solve the poverty issue.
I love that answer. And I think, again, the poverty issue is critical here. What in your work as a defense attorney addresses that poverty issue?
Well, I think what we try to do is we try to put our clients in a position to be successful after the conclusion of their case. Understanding that people having access to first and foremost education, secondly to employment opportunities are those types of things that will counter the poverty issue. And I think that's the best thing that we can do. And we need more focus there. So job training, education, those are the things that we need to push. And many of that can start even if a client finds themselves incarcerated. The education can begin there. The job training can begin there. And then once they are released from incarceration, they can put those skills to good use.
Yes, so set them up to climb out of poverty. All right, stay with us, everyone. We'll be right back. What I was saying was that I'm looking here at some of the areas of defense. And by the way, because you didn't hear me when I was muted, I am here with Robert L. Jenkins. He is a defense attorney in Washington, D.C. And one of the things that's listed here is that you've defended people accused of drug offenses, sexual assaults, violations, and capital murder. For me, it feels like capital murder is just like way up there. You know, drug offenses is one thing. Capital murder is like, whoa. How did that work for you? Like, I'm curious to know, you know, what kind of mindset and hearts do you have to be able to defend somebody who's been accused of capital murder? What's your approach there? Because I think that's huge.
Well, you know, I have had the good fortune to represent many individuals charged with capital punishment over the last 25 years. I even currently have at least 2 clients right now who are facing capital punishment. You know, some call it the highest calling for a criminal defense attorney to represent someone whose life is literally on the line. I've also had the misfortune to even have to lose clients to capital punishment. Over my career, I've had 4 clients who actually were executed.
Oh my goodness.
Several I have actually witnessed myself, the punishment carried out. It certainly is something that comes with, it goes without saying, a massive amount of responsibility to be in that situation. But it goes to the heart of what I am and what I chose to devote my life to. And that is ensuring that everyone in this country charged with any criminal offense, no matter how small or significant, is afforded due process. And that they're treated fairly and that they're given a fair and adequate opportunity to defend themselves. And so I feel honored whenever I have been called upon to do something, because it also speaks to a tremendous amount of faith that family, or however you were selected in order to be in that position to do that, that they have in you and your ability, because there's no greater punishment that we know in this country than to take someone's life for the commission of a crime.
Wow. I would imagine that nowadays that calling has to be more difficult than possibly the past. And maybe I shouldn't say even more difficult, but different, in that we have seemed to lose a sense of respect as a nation for due process. We want to try them online on our social media pages, in public forums.
Yes.
And not really having the respect to just let this process play out with dignity. What are your perspectives on that?
Well, certainly, I believe that as our society has advanced, and the internet and now social media in particular, we all have greater access to information. And by having greater access to information, we believe that we're in an enhanced position to arrive at conclusions quicker than before. Almost all the facts and trials are played out even before the person is arrested sometimes, and people begin to form their opinions and their conclusions. And one of the biggest challenges that has represented for people who do what I do, and even on the prosecution side, is trying to find 12 people who are truly impartial. 12 people who haven't heard about the allegations against the defendant, don't know much about the case, and haven't already concluded in their mind whether the person is guilty or the person is not guilty. And that's becoming more and more of a challenge, as again, we have a wider array of information that's available to us 24 hours a day. Sometimes these sources of information are biased themselves, and they are advocating a particular position in order to, develop a story to meet their agenda, whatever that agenda might be.
Yeah, and I would add to that, just to add a little of my flavor. I think most of the time that information we see on social media is biased and having an agenda. So I am excited about being able to present some research to you all on the other side of this break. So I have some research that we're going to look at, that I hope that Attorney Jenkins will be willing to offer some insight on. And so stay with us. We've got a lot more for you. We'll be right back. All right. Welcome back to the live exchange. I'm Dr. Pamela, and just joined by Robert Jenkins Jr. And just to give a little bit of some insight, there's 4 things that we can do to end mass incarceration. And number 1, eliminate prison for lower level crimes. So what are we sending people to prison for? And does it make sense for people to go to prison for these types of crimes? Number 2, reduce sentence minimums and maximums that are currently on the book. If someone commits a serious crime like robbery, yes, they should be punished, but there's little evidence that staying in prison for such long periods, like 20 or 30 years, actually rehabilitates people. Number 3, making changes retroactive. So, for people that are there already, how do we make sure they also benefit from these changes? And then just generating more ideas. Don't let that idea generation stop. So there are a lot of different ways that we can improve the criminal justice system, and eliminating things like the 3 strikes law. I remember when that law came into practice in California, and just how drastically that impacted the Black community, truth in sentencing and so forth. So would love to hear your thoughts on this. And, do you see these as solutions that are actually happening, or that we need to get moving on?
Well, I certainly see some evidence that some of what you touched on, the legal community is starting to embrace. I think there is a trend of moving away from mandatory minimum sentences, for example. I think there's a trend to move away from rigid sentencing schemes, to once again return judges back to having a broader or wider array of discretion in determining what's the appropriate punishment for this particular individual that is before them at that particular time. Yeah. Now, that doesn't come without some dangers and some risk. Part of the reason why we got to where we started to adopt mandatory minimums and more rigid sentencing schemes was because many complained in the old system, where judges had wide discretion, that was a bad thing, because it resulted in a disparity in treatment among people. You could have a minority in New York that committed an offense that might receive 30 years. You could have a member of the majority community in Wyoming who committed the exact same offense, and because the judge in Wyoming had wide discretion, that person received probation. So some looked at the system and said, look, we have to bring some standards here, where regardless of where you are in the country, if you commit a certain type of offense, your sentence will always fall within a particular range, so that there won't be room for someone to say, well, someone received this sentence because they are a minority, or because of their gender, or because of their racial background or national origin. So you just keep in mind that with wide discretion, with eliminating mandatory minimums and rigid sentencing ranges, you do have certain other problems that are going to be inherent to the system. But I do overall think that judges should be once again empowered to make those decisions, to determine where a particular defendant lies in the risk category, and determine whether or not prison or some other alternative is more appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much subjectivity in the process, and it's a double-edged sword, because on one hand, if you normalize or regulate where everything needs to kind of fall in the same range, then there's disparities that might not be accounted for, from case to case. So it's kind of, in some cases, the objectivity makes sense when it's not grounded in race, any of the isms. On the other hand, we see cases like a mother who used a different zip code so her kid can go to a better school, who gets years in prison, versus the parents that we all know about, the high profile case of USC, and them using all kinds of falsified information, and really seems like a slap on the wrist.
What a slap on the wrist. Yeah. Well, a lot of people, don't know this, or probably even those of us who lived through it would like to forget it. But mandatory minimums, one of their chief advocates for bringing mandatory minimums to bear were actually the minority community, actually the poor minority community, as a way of, one, believing that it would level the playing field, so that racism would be at least minimized in the whole sentencing regimen, but also because many in the minority community, especially with the crack epidemic in the mid-'80s, felt like the government was not doing enough to be tough enough on drug offenders, and that there was a belief led by the Congressional Black Caucus that tougher sentences that removed discretion from judges was the right answer. 30, 40 years later, we know they were wrong.
Yeah. And we evolve. We do evolve, as we get a greater understanding of these things.
Yes.
And just as a point of clarification, are you having to leave us soon?
No, actually, I do have some additional time. My 12:30 commitment has gone away. So I can stay on.
I appreciate it, and had it not, I would have made you late because I didn't acknowledge it until now. But I appreciate that. So one of the questions that I also wanted to ask is just in terms of defending a high-profile case. What are some of the ways in which you care for that person, and just to make sure that they are receiving fair treatment throughout this process? And do you need to know? This question is based on movies I've seen. So, do you need to know whether or not they are actually guilty or not? Does that matter to you, or is it about making sure the process works the way it's supposed to work?
Okay. Well, certainly in a high-profile case, probably the biggest consideration you have is trying to give the client good counsel and advice about his behavior outside of the courtroom, because he's already somebody who has attracted the public's attention, that everything they do during the pendency of the case while they're out is under a microscope. So you want to make sure that they understand and appreciate that, and give them some good advice on how they can minimize that impact, because that can be have an adverse impact on what actually is going to go on in the courtroom and how the full case is going to play out. Now, the second part of your question is one that I've been being asked. I'm probably going back to law school, certainly since my first days out of law school. Is it important for you to know whether or not the person actually committed the offense when you're representing them? In theory, it should not matter. Your job is to say whether or not you are aware that the facts are true as alleged, or whether or not the person is not guilty of the offense. It really shouldn't matter. Your job is to zealously represent them, to advocate on their behalf to the best of your ability. That is the job, regardless of whether or not the person is in fact guilty. Now, at the same time, I will say to you that many of us find an extra motivation when we feel the burden or the responsibility of representing someone that we truly believe did not commit the offense. Because I don't think any criminal defense attorney, for that matter, a judge or prosecutor, wants to play a role in the conviction and incarceration of an innocent person. So I think everyone who's involved in the system, we all believe that that's the worst possible outcome of any criminal proceeding. It is not that a guilty person was set free. That's not the worst possible thing. The worst possible outcome is someone being denied their liberty or even their life when they did not commit the offense. So that brings about an extra layer of responsibility and burden and one that I have come to embrace. So I do believe it has some impact, but as I said, philosophically, it should not.
I really admire what you just said about, basically, if we're looking at worst case scenarios, the worst case scenario is not that somebody who committed the crime is set free. The worst case scenario is somebody who did not commit the crime is incarcerated. And I think that that probably challenges a lot of mindsets, because we are in a society that is all about punishment. That you did it, you need to get that punishment. And I tend to agree with you on this, that it is even worse with somebody who shouldn't be there, who should not have been incarcerated, is found guilty. I think we have this fear, if we let somebody go who committed a crime, it's going to be they're going to do all kinds of things to all kinds of other people. And I would venture to say that the odds of that is probably not as high as we think it is.
Yeah, I certainly tend to agree. I believe that, what we want is to make sure that those people who have been accused of offenses are not wrongfully convicted, because that's the worst that I believe our society can do, is to deny somebody their liberty. Time on this earth is the most precious commodity we have. It is not renewable. Every day you live is one day less you have on this earth. And that's just a matter of fact. Yeah. So people who have been wrongfully convicted, who then spend time in prison, and then years later you hear they get out. I don't care how much money that they're given in compensation, they can never get that time back.
Yeah, I have such a heart and a passion for that issue. I feel my emotions rising even just hearing you talk about that. So I want to stay on that a little bit longer after this commercial. So we're going to do that. We're going to go to our commercials. And then when we come back, I just want to touch on that a little bit more. So stay with us. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back to the Live Exchange. I'm Dr. Pamela, and I am joined by Robert L. Jenkins, a defense attorney in Washington, D.C. And there's a famous case out there right now about a wrongful incarceration. That's one of the things that I'm very passionate about, because it's probably one of the worst things that can happen to a person, to have their life and livelihood taken from them, and there's nothing they can do about it. And there's a case that I've been focusing on for the past probably 6 months or so, and that's of Maya Moore, an NBA player who she's actually doing work for this kind of justice, and he was focused particularly on Jonathan Irons, who was falsely accused of a burglary and the shooting in St. Louis. And there were a lot of different holes in his case, but he spent 2 decades in prison. And Maya Moore spent a lot of time fighting for his case, and he actually was released. They are now married, by the way, which is an interesting twist to the story. But these kinds of cases, I imagine, there's organizations that their intent is to bring these cases to light. Are they as common and as frequent as, they just seem to, it just seems that it happens a lot, that we have these wrongful incarcerations.
Well, it's difficult to quantify how often it happens, right? Because we only know about the ones where the person's innocence was actually proven at a later date. And so if we go by those numbers, statistically, it would suggest that it does not happen very often, because the number of exonerations statistically are relatively minute. That doesn't mean that there aren't more cases out there where people are languishing in prison. It doesn't mean that there haven't been innocent people executed in this country, because everything I know about capital punishment, my work within that community, my study of history of this country, all leads me to conclude without a shadow of doubt that it has happened. But I can't give you a precise number on it, because again, we can only measure those cases that we were actually able to successfully prove that the person was innocent. And sometimes we're just not in a position to do that. It doesn't mean that the person isn't innocent. It's just that the facts didn't really bear out.
Yeah, and I was trying to figure out how to ask you that question without asking what's the numbers, because how are we to know?
Yeah.
You know, that's a very but you know, it seems that there are enough cases that are actually in the process of appeal to be to raise concerns, you know, about how this is all playing out. I want to shift a little bit to police brutality, and what that means in terms of the trust and the relationship that the Black community has with the legal system as a whole. I mean, there's one thing about the relationship they have with police officers, but in your view, how does this taint the view or impact the view of the legal system for the people you've worked with?
Well, first and foremost, let me say this. I don't believe that there's been an uptake in police brutality cases, or that police over the last 5 or 10 years have become more heavy-handed in dealing with certain communities. I think what has shifted is merely the fact that with technology, with cell phones, with everyone having a recording device in the palm of their hand, more of it is being captured on TV. And I don't believe also that the Black community's attitudes toward law enforcement and these type of heavy-handed tactics have shifted much at all. As a young kid growing up in the 70s in Charleston, South Carolina, I saw it firsthand. And people in my neighborhood knew and had great apprehension about law enforcement, about the criminal justice system. And I haven't seen that shift in my 50 plus years here on this planet. It's pretty much been the same. So I think the level of mistrust and the tension between law enforcement and certain communities has been there for a long time. This is not new, and it's something that we have to deal with in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, these were issues that I remember coming up when I grew up in Southern California. And, you know, so of course, Rodney King was the big thing. You know, we had a number of cases before and after that, you know, just continued to play out. So, you know, I agree because we see it more, because it's more visible and we're able to capture it, personally able to capture it, you know, that has really heightened the awareness of something we've been saying has been happening all along. Do you think that what happened over the last year in 2020 with the different protests and the calls for, you know, revamping, you know, the way that police systems are operating, do you see this as something that might result in a shift or a change, or do you see this kind of more of the same?
No, you know, I do believe in, you know, maybe it's just my optimism and wishful thinking. But I do believe that what we saw play out over this past summer will certainly impact the majority community's view of what minority communities have been saying about law enforcement and police brutality the most. That's where I believe that the impact will be. Because I think that for those who don't reside in those communities, don't have close connections with those communities, this was a foreign notion to them. That law enforcement sometimes go too far, that they treat certain members from certain communities differently than members from others. I think the recent incident at the U.S. Capitol helped to put that on full display also. It's very, very, very difficult for anyone to objectively review the media reports and accounts of what happened on January 6th and compare it to what we saw with going as far back as Rodney King being captured on video, and all the many, many other incidents. Gardner, it's hard not to conclude that there was a significant disparity in the treatment of those who were primarily white versus those who were minorities. And I think that, or at least again, I'm hopeful that will cause those members of the majority community to take a second look and say, hey, there really is something here. It's clear as day.
Yeah. And I also, as cynical and conspiracy theory minded as I can be at times, I'm also very optimistic. And I guess I was very much moved by the movements that happened this summer and the diversity of the people in those protests. The images of police officers taking a knee with the protesters. There's a lot of things that are happening. And in the previous segment, we talked about, how much of this is performative justice and how much of this is actual justice. And I think that even if it was performative justice in some ways, it compelled people to take to the streets or to feel like, maybe taking a knee is not such a bad thing. And so, I think all of it had the potential or has the potential to move us forward in ways that we have not yet really seen in this society.
Yeah. And I think there's small things we can point to, right? You mentioned about taking a knee, years ago when Colin Kaepernick, started to take a knee, he was vilified outside of his own community for doing so. Many called it disrespectful, un-American, things of that nature. And I think there has been a shift. I think that now with the benefit of hindsight and the things that have happened since he first started taking a knee, I think there are a lot of people who at first were hostile to his actions have come around and see it differently. For those of us who always supported him and believed in his efforts, nothing much has changed with us. But I think where the greatest impact can be measured is how he is viewed differently by them.
Yeah. So I hear the music. Does that mean we're getting ready? Okay. So I want to ask you this question before the break, because I want you to think about this when we come back. Okay. If we were to put 2020 in a history book, which we know this is going to happen, and we give things eras, civil rights movement, the Renaissance movement, think about what this era might be called and how we might describe the impact of this era in a history book. So I want you to think about that. When we come back, then I'll give you a chance to answer. Stay with us. All right, welcome back to the live exchange. I'm Dr. Pamela, and I am joined by Robert L. Jenkins, and we are talking about police brutality and mass incarceration. We have 5 minutes before we close out, but I wanted to just get your thoughts, Attorney Jenkins, on how we might describe 2020 in the history books in the future, about that era. And I say that era like it was a long time ago, and the impact that it has on our society.
If first and foremost, I wouldn't just limit it to 2020 in answering your question. I'd like to think that we are in the midst of a new era. And I think that it probably started, if I had to find a point in our recent history to say this was the beginning of it, I would say it was the election of the 44th president of the United States. And what has happened since that time, the country electing the first minority as president, up until most recently electing the first female vice president, who also is a minority, and where we are looking and re-examining race and re-examining historical figures and monuments and things of that nature. I would like for this period to be known as an awakening. I don't know if it will be, but I sense in the country, in examining its 200 plus years of history and all that has transpired, I do see a shift. And some certainly are driving a backlash. And I think that's what we saw with the election of the 45th president and what we saw on January the 6th. I think that's a response to the positive awakening that we're having in this country. When I look at Congress and I see more women elected in the United States Congress than ever before at any point in our history. When I see more African Americans, when I see 3 African American male senators, 2 hailing from the South, one from Georgia and one from my home state, South Carolina, one a Republican, one a Democrat. That's something that when I was a child growing up in South Carolina, I could never even imagine. I grew up in the South Carolina of Strong Thurmond. I could never imagine an African-American man holding his seat. That is truly amazing for me. So I would like to think that we're in the midst of an awakening. We've lived through the Renaissance, the Civil Rights Movement, all of that. That's what I would like to think. And again, maybe that's just the optimist in me.
That is such a hopeful way to end the show. I love that it would be an awakening. And if you ever find the time to write a book, that you might want to just coin that. I really love that. So we're, like I said, we're going to wrap up, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to let people know how they can follow what you're doing, get involved if there's any opportunities with what you're doing. How can we all follow you?
Well, we certainly have a very active, engaged social media presence. You can find us on Facebook. Our law firm's name is BonhamandJenkinsLaw.com. You can find us, again, on Twitter at Attorney Jenkins, Instagram, Attorney Jenkins, at Attorney Jenkins also. So certainly look us up, engage with us, and we'll try to be as helpful as what we can in disseminating information to you.
Okay, great. Is it possible to flash that on the screen? I don't know if we have it or not, maybe not. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has just been so incredibly insightful for me. I appreciate your grace in some of my questions about the legal system. We're all learning. And I think we all need to find ways to fit in, as part of the solution. So I appreciate you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yes, absolutely. So I thank you all for joining us this week, and we're going to be back next week. We're going to be looking at history makers, modern day history makers. We just talked about it today, and I think Attorney Jenkins is a modern day history maker. But we're going to be talking about that next week from 11 to 1. So remember, together we can right the wrongs, we can speak the truth, we can rise above, and we can stand for change. Join us every week to talk humanity, intellect, and change. Have a great week.